Shalom, welcome, friends. We're so glad to be learning with you today, wherever you are in the world, on this very important topic, which is often stigmatized and not discussed as much as it should be. But thankfully, we're here with a great educator who's going to help us think about that. And whether you're in the Zoom or you're on the live stream, if you have questions, feel free to post there, and we will be monitoring those questions. So we will be sure to have a chance to engage with that. We're here today with Rabbi Dr. Chaim Tureff, who endeavors to build human connections and help all people relate to one another. He is the founder of STARS, which guides people struggling with addiction by focusing on the spiritual component through seminars, groups, and one-on-one coaching. He's also the Rav Beit Sefer at Pressman Academy in Los Angeles, a spiritual advisor at Soberman's Estate in Arizona, just north of Scottsdale, a member of the Teachers on Fire Kollel, and a regular contributor to the Jewish Press. He's a producer on an upcoming documentary about African Americans and Jewish Americans, and recently wrote a book on recovery in the Torah, models of spirituality and healing, which deals with intersection of Torah and addiction recovery. That is the book that we are here to discuss today. So Reb Chaim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So what's an example of how you see the intersection between Torah or Judaism and addiction or recovery?
I see it in a sense that everything is in the Torah, right? Somewhere. And so for the way that I look at things, the way that my brain kind of works is that when I'm looking at a parsha or I'm looking at something in the Torah, I see when, there might be a pasuk and it just calls out, right? And like that has something to do with recovery, meaning this idea that Hashem poses issues for us and also gives us, right, I don't have the exact quote, but gives us almost the antidote, so to speak. We just have to be able to kind of look and find it. And so that's kind of how I see it. And so I see within our spiritual practice, right, we have lots of opportunities to look and see and find recovery. And the Torah also, the beautiful thing about the Torah is that it offers all kinds of human conditions, right? So it speaks to everybody, no matter where we're at. And so there are lots of places in the Torah that are explicit and not as explicit, right, when it comes to addiction, and depending on how one might see it. So it offers that opportunity for us to kind of take a look and see, which is super important for anybody that's in the world and struggling with whatever they're struggling with, that there's a place in the Torah for that. So there's not this fear that I'm the only person struggling with whatever it might be.
Interesting. So for some listeners, I'm sure they're immersed in this world. For others, this may be brand new. How would you define addiction and how would you define recovery?
I would say addiction is the doing something, right, that you don't want to be doing and you keep doing it over and over again, right? So that's different than just using the example, I had a little too much cake today, right? And so you're like, right? And then you move on and once in a while you're like, I didn't really need that piece of chocolate cake, but it was good and I'm fine and I move on. As opposed to addiction is that I'm doing something that I don't want to be doing, that I would like to not be doing, that I would like to stop, and that inability to stop. Right, that's kind of the difference, as opposed to somebody who might be described as having a habit that they want to quit, as opposed to an addiction, which really gets inside our souls and something that's we're trying to separate from. And recovery, I would say recovery. I mean, truthfully, I'm going to use this term, which I did not coin, Beit Tshuva. I teach at Beit Tshuva every so often in Los Angeles. The founder, Harriet, came up with this. As far as I know, she came up with it. Maybe she came up with it from somebody else. but it's a beautiful statement, which is everybody's in recovery from something. So it doesn't need to be drugs, alcohol, sex, food, shopping, tech, work, so on and so forth. But everybody is in recovery from something. We're all working on something. So recovery is that ability to take that first step and say, here's something that I'm struggling with, whatever that it is, and I wanna better myself.
Okay, fascinating. That's fascinating. I actually spent a week at Beit Tshuva last year, and I learned so much there. It was just an incredible experience. So thanks for bringing that up. What have you seen regarding the stigma about addiction in the Jewish community?
It's very real. I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think it's unique in the sense in the Jewish community that it's only with addiction. I would say anything that is outside the parameters of those Arba Amot, the four walls of normality, whatever that is. I don't even know what that is in this realm that we live in anymore. But whatever those falls without outside that, there's a stigma and people feel almost ashamed, and can they not talk about it? I remember just an example being miscarriage. My wife had a miscarriage. Like, we don't talk about that. You can't discuss that. Or I have a brother that's special needs. You can go into a shul and you could go to a shul your entire life and never see somebody that you actually know that has special needs or family that has special needs, unless people are more comfortable. Some shuls are more comfortable, some they're not, right? And those are just two examples that have nothing to do with addiction. But I would say in general, in the Jewish realm, there is this stigma for anything that's not based in normality. And so when it comes to addiction, if I had a nickel for every time I was told that's a Goysha problem, that's not a Jewish problem, or that's not an issue within the Frum community, those are Baal Tshuvas, that's right, all those things, I would be a millionaire because, right? And so I think there's a busha, there's an embarrassment because it's seen as a weakness. And especially, I would say more so, it's in all communities that there is this an embarrassment. I would say sometimes more so in the more traditional or from communities, there's even more so because you're studying or you're portraying that you study Torah, you're portraying that you're living a life of Torah, and then on the side, right, you're compulsively looking at pornography, or on the side you're drinking compulsively, or you're doing drugs, or you're whatever those are. And so there's an embarrassment because you're like, I believe in a higher power, I believe in this, I believe in the Torah, and yet I'm doing something that is diametrically opposed to the very thing that I believe.
Mhm.
So
Fascinating. Yeah. So what do you think is something important for people to know about this topic that they likely don't know?
something that is important that they know, that it's out there. I think that's just something like today that we're having, and that God willing people will listen to, just knowing that it's a real thing, right? It's not something that is the other. It's not I live in Los Angeles, so it's not, oh, that's because that woman, she's experiencing homelessness, so of course she's on drugs, and she might very well be, quite honestly, be on drugs. That's them, that's not me, right? So to know that this is something that needs to be discussed in communities. It's one of the hardest things that I come up against, where I'm blessed to come and speak in certain communities, right? They already are opening the door, right? It might be the first time that they have a discussion on Shabbos about addiction and tying in Torah and all of that, which is beautiful. At least they're letting me in the door. Many places, they don't even want to talk of it. Like, I've been told also, that's not an issue here.
Mhm.
And so I would say just having the awareness is something that, I know that's not so profound, but it's really that basic, just having the awareness. I don't think I've ever spoken anywhere, whether it's a Chabad or it's a Reform synagogue or anything in between or outside those bounds, where I haven't had at least a half dozen people after I'm done come up and say, I used to have a heroin addiction. I had a gentleman, I spoke at a shul in Hendersonville, North Carolina. a Reform synagogue about 3 weeks ago, and I had a gentleman come up to me and he says, "I bet you've never met an 82-year-old heroin addict." And it was great. He's been in recovery, thank God, and he's sober for many years. But I think just that awareness. I don't know how many times he said that before. I don't know if he's talked about it in his shul or not before, but just that idea of having that awareness so people can know they can go to their family, they can go to their friends, they can go to their rabbi, they can go to their whomever it might be, and not need to be scared to go, it's in the back corner of somewhere, some dark room, and I can't really
Mm-hmm.
talk about it.
I've heard a few times from friends and colleagues that someone in their life has been moved to a recovery center. There was an intervention made in their life. The person moved to a recovery center, and this friend wants to know how to support them, right? Whether that person is not allowed to make phone calls or they're very limited phone calls or emails. And the friend feels like, oh, I want to be there for them in some way, but I don't know how to be. What do you recommend they do at a time like that?
Depending depending on where they're at. And what I mean by that is depending on the treatment center that they're at. If the treatment center, they're obviously all different centers. So um, I would say the normative is that they have limited phone call, limited texts, depending on where it is. And I would honor that, right? Not like, because is that about what can I do? Is that about me feeling the discomfort of not being able to be there for them? Or if is it what's best for this person who's in the treatment center? So if they're in a treatment center and let's say they have limited capability because they need to focus on what they need to focus on, right? It's to almost to prepare a plan for when they're out. So what can I do actually to support them once they're out, as opposed to while they're there? Hopefully, God willing, wherever they're located, they're in a place that actually cares about their sobriety and cares about building a plan and a healthy plan, right? And so once they come out, they're going to need all the support they can because they're in a bubble. If they're in a good center, if they're in a good treatment center, they're in a bubble somewhat, right? And so even when things come up, and let's say they're able to talk to a family member and it goes awry, there's a therapist there, there's a counselor, there are friends, there's everybody that can kind of get on board. But when it comes to being in the real world, so to speak, that might not be, they might be at work and their spouse, their ex-spouse or a parent might text them and send them completely spiraling out of control. So to answer the question is to make sure that that person knows that you're there for them. And when they're out, like regularly check on them, see what they need, not what you need to make you feel better for them, but what do they
Mhm.
need to help them? So that might be
Right.
going to lunch. It might be talking. It might just be listening. It might be
Mhm.
whatever, driving them to a meeting, who knows? Let
Mhm.
them tell you, but again, let them know that you're there for them. And sometimes this happens in life, whether it's with addiction, whether it's after somebody passes away, people are really there right at the beginning. And then a month later, 2 months later, understandably, people go their own ways and they do their own things. So it would really be building a plan for yourself to say, like, I want to make sure that I check in on whomever it is weekly. And if they answer, great. And if they don't, that's okay too. It's not about me, it's about them.
Right, right. Sometimes I'll meet someone who says, I'm an alcoholic or I'm a drug addict, and I've been sober 20 years or 30 years. Um, when someone has been clean that long, what what does it mean about their vulnerability or their identity that they still identify to some degree as an addict or as an alcoholic?
I think it's there are a couple parts to it. It's allowing you to know that they're being open, right? So they're letting you know, here's a little bit about me, right? And so they are being vulnerable in that sense. They're also, depending on who it is and where they are, they're letting you know, um, let's say they come to your house for Shabbos dinner, they're letting you know, look, I'm not going to have any wine.
Uh,
And,
uh,
and they want to put those parameters up. I've right, I've seen many times. I went to Chabad Yeshiva, right, for Bregan. It's almost like you're not going to have a drink. Like, what's wrong with you? And
Right.
so, come on, it's a shot. You'll be okay, right? Or whatever it might be. So they're letting you know, and they're almost putting up those boundaries also. And I would say this in not in a gaiva way, not in a way of pride in a bad way, but almost in humbleness, saying, I am sober. Like, I'm letting you know I'm sober. Yes, I maybe, who knows what they did do when they were not sober, but I've made it, and I'm a survivor. It's kind of, when somebody shows you, lahavdil, I know I'm not exactly, but somebody who has gone through the Holocaust and they show you their number. My wife's grandmother, may she rest in peace, would show the number. That's not prideful, but it's saying, like, I'm a survivor. I'm still here. And it helps other people, because by them saying to you or to somebody else, I'm in recovery, you might be struggling with that very same thing, and you're so embarrassed that you wouldn't know who to go to. So they're identifying, or even if you're not, you might know somebody, and so who's suffering, and you can pair them up.
To get to the spiritual side of the soul for a moment, I think that just to different degrees, we all feel we're not enough. We're not enough. We're not good looking enough. We're not wealthy enough. We're not loved enough. We don't have enough, to very different degrees. And in talking with people in recovery for a long time, one of the most common things I've heard was there was a hole in me and I tried to fill it. And we all fill our holes of not being enough in different unhealthy ways, sometimes healthy ways, but often unhealthy ways. And so I used drugs, or I was a sex addict, or I just drank all the time to fill that hole of not being enough. So I wonder, what is some of the spiritual work when one feels that they're not enough, to rebuilding that sense of self-worth?
So there's a saying, you mentioned there's this hole, right? And so we say there's a hole in the soul, right? And so if there's a hole in my soul, then what do I need to fill it up with? Something spiritual, right? And not that this is necessarily an easy thing, but if we can come to it starting with, I'm here in this world at this very moment. There's a reason that God, that my higher power put me in this world in this very moment. I have something very special to offer. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here in this moment. And each one of us has that. Now, we have the capability, unfortunately, we've seen throughout history, and we're living it today, where people use that ability to the detriment, right? For all kinds of things, unfortunately. But we're all given that unique task. And that's sometimes that lack of belief, the lack of belief that I don't matter. That's really, I don't matter. I'm not that important. And if you think about it in the sense of, well, the universe is this big, and then in the universe, there's a universe. I don't know. I'm not a scientist necessarily, but I know that there's so much out there. And what am I? A little speck of, right? You could look at it that way, and that's the humility part. But unfortunately, most of us are not on that level that we have that ability to have that humility, because that takes a lot. Instead, we go to the opposite. Oh, I'm just this little speck. I'm not important. And it's just the opposite. Kol v'chomer. I'm here in this vast universe, and I'm living, and I matter to somebody, to something. There's something that I'm put here for. That means that I am very important. And again, not in a prideful way, but in a beautiful way. I matter, right? And so it has to start with your thinking. That's where it starts. It starts. So I would say two parts. So one, that changing my thinking to I matter, I'm important, I'm here for a purpose. And one practice, this is a spiritual practice that I teach about quite often, and I do workshops on, is gratitude. So integrating gratitude into our as a spiritual practice. And so having gratitude changes the way that I think, right? And then that allows me to fill up my hole in my soul with meaning, as opposed to dessert, as opposed to sex, as opposed to whatever else it might be. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm not saying that I'm not criticizing one who does that. But once we change our thinking, right, the brain is pattern seeking. We know that. So once we change, right, we change the way that we think about things. We change those patterns, right? We change the way that the neurotransmitters, we change the way those new pathways are built, and they're built with gratitude. Then we see things a little bit differently.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I love that. There's so much there for us all to think about wherever we are in recovery. So, going back to recovery in the Torah, models of spirituality and healing, what are some of your hopes for this book?
My hopes are that those that need it will find it. my, that's my hope. My hopes are that, and my prayer is that somebody who reads it will say, "Oh, I find meaning in this." So I can think of somebody that I spoke to, who I was working with, who's grew up in a Haredi upbringing. I would say knows a lot more, and I'm not saying this judging myself, but it's just a fact, knows a lot more Torah than I do. Grew up in the Yiddish world, speaking Yiddish as a first language, like really immersed. And they told me, they're like, "Oh, I read one of the parshiot in the book, and it had to do with anger." And they said, if I had just seen that and learned about anger that way when I was younger, maybe I wouldn't have gotten to where I'm at as far as their addiction. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because I don't think addiction works there's not so much simplicity there. There's a lot that goes involved, but the point being is that it was meaningful to him, right? And that I wrote it in such a way that hopefully people will find meaning in it, regardless of where they're at on the spectrum of Judaism. And honestly, I wrote it in a way that one who believes in a higher power, who's not necessarily Jewish, could also find meaning into it, right? Somebody who's like, "Oh, I like the Old Testament," right? They can read it and they can still connect, because it's all about, even if you're not an addict per se, you can read it, and I would say, put it into the category of self-help, if that's right, in that sense.
Awesome. So, last question for you today, and I've learned so much from you. I'm so grateful. In addition to putting out the book, what other goals do you have in doing this kind of work?
My goals are in helping people to really um, to help people grow. And so whether that's, again, going back to, I think, maybe your second question, when it came to stigma, there's so much stigma. Even people that know that I work in this field, even people that I can share experiences, right, throughout my life, still feel, thinking about in my community, just in Los Angeles, people that know me or know of me and somebody will send them to come speak to me. Even in that sense, they feel shame. And like, there's no shame. There's nothing, like, not at all. And yet they still feel that. So my hope is that it becomes more normalized, right? In the sense that people can feel more comfortable to talk about it. And there will be more 12-step meetings in synagogues, and there will be much more open dialogue. And just like there's a dialogue about Israel or anti-Semitism, even before October 7th, that's like a staple at synagogues, right? That's a staple at synagogues that, it can be talked about at least once a year, somehow woven into the drasha that, there's this idea of people that struggle with addiction, and it's not a one-off. And that so people can come out, because quite honestly, it impacts, according to conservative estimates, 10% of the population, and according to less conservative, studies, 20% of the population in one way or another, in the United States, I'm talking about. So there isn't anybody that's not impacted, right? So that people can feel comfortable. And once people feel comfortable and feel that there's a home for them, then that's the first step to recovery. Living in your shame, right? Living in that sadness, living in that loss, you can't find recovery there.
I actually want to ask you one more question, because being that we're a social action group, I want to ask you a political question. There's a lot of political conversation around war on drugs, criminalization, drinking age, opioid crisis. And I wonder, I mean, there's so much there and the list goes on, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on some of what that conversation looks like, or any of your views on kind of how the political realm intersects with this world of recovery and addiction.
I think I would say, I don't want to say a blanket statement of saying 100%. I was about to say 100%, but that's not true, because there are unique situations. I would say within 90% of people that are arrested when it comes to drug use or alcohol or DUIs or any of these things, that they should have treatment, right? And I'm just going to give you an example, and I know that it could rub people the wrong way, and I respect that, and you don't have to agree with me. There was a gentleman who played for the Raiders football team, which is now in Las Vegas, and he was arrested 2 years ago. He was driving under the influence, and he killed somebody. And so he's now in jail for the next 20 years, 25 years. And I have no pull, so there's nothing I could do. But my first thought was, if I could have, I would have wanted to go. I mean, I live very close to Vegas, to go there and to advocate and say, like, this gentleman could do more good by going to a treatment center for the next year, allowing him then to play football, because that's his parnassa, that's right, and to go, and part of his recovery is going to schools every week all over the country, going to college campuses where it's really an issue, and to talk about drinking, and to talk about, he would have much more impact than myself or you or others. Like, here's, in our society, people look up to athletes. That's just how it works, right? And he would get more out of it than sitting in jail for the next 20 years. And I feel that way. I'm just using him as an example because I really feel like, in general, when people are struggling with alcohol, with drugs, whatever it might be, but it's usually alcohol and drugs, and they're thrown into jail, right? There are people that get sober in jail, most certainly. But overall, it's not conducive to that. It just isn't. Jails are not conducive to being like, oh, I'm going to come out and better. People that do, they're incredible. And there are people that do. And they're incredible stories. But I feel like there should be treatment centers set up to help people. And not a 4-week treatment center, not a 6-week, but the money that we're spending on jails to spend on helping people get sober, and then allow them to lend their voices, and through action. Anybody that stays sober, who's really sober, and who's really working the program, not only are they not drinking or not using drugs, they're somebody who's socially conscious when it comes to going out and doing. They help other people. That's what they do. And so the greatest advocate for somebody to not use is somebody who's used, because they know, they've lived it. They know exactly, they know every button, even if it's not the same substance, it does not matter.
Fascinating. Friends, when we talk about Tikkun Olam, most people are talking about advocating for legislation or rallying in the streets, but there's so many different ways to engage in improving the world. And this is another way to make sure we reduce the stigmas, we create healing in our communities, we reach out to people who, as we repair our souls and create space for other people's repair and healing, that we embrace what our communities can look like when we reduce this stigma and embrace others' full recovery journey. I hope you will all look at Recovery in the Torah, Models of Spirituality and Healing. Rabbi Chaim Tureff, thank you.
Thank you.